Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Rohingya, and specifically those Rohingya who currently find themselves at sea right in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, which countries around the world are dealing with as well. They've been refused entry. At least 2 boats that we know of have been refused entry into Malaysia. Bangladesh has also just said it will not allow these boats to enter into its country either. Where does this leave this Rohingya at this point in time? We know that these are long-suffering people. They are the most persecuted minority, according to the United Nations, and they have been for a while now. Just last week, we had reports of a number of Rohingya dying at sea as well from starvation and otherwise. Who will really step up at this point in time and deal with this issue as well? Certainly, every country has its own issues to deal with within its own borders of its own citizens, and how to deal with social distancing in developing countries, which have a lot of poverty as well on their own. Nevertheless, we can't all just ignore the fact that these are people at sea right now suffering, and they need to be as well respected, and their human rights need to be, of course, taken into account. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Shafiur Rahman, who is a Bangladeshi British documentary filmmaker. He's joining us now from Cambridge in the UK. He's been working on Rohingya issues since December 2016. We're also joined by Farid Khan, who is the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations at the Rohingya Human Rights Network. He's joining us now from Ottawa in Canada. Farid, good morning to you, and Shafiur Rahman, thank you for your time today as well. Let me go to you, Shafiur Rahman, with the question. What do you make of the issue of these Rohingya right now who find themselves on these boats at sea? Malaysia and Bangladesh both do not want them.
I think it's a horrendous situation. Only this week, my fixer was able to speak to some of the relatives who came off there, whose children were in the boat that was allowed to disembark. And the stories I heard were just terrible. People were thrown overboard who were weak. They're saying between 20 and 50 deaths.
Farid, what are your thoughts? We just gotten cut off with you a moment ago. What are your thoughts about these Rohingya who are at sea right now and find themselves essentially without a place to go?
Well, I think that as the world's attention is focused elsewhere on COVID-19, we can't forget about the Rohingya. They are still being persecuted. They are still fleeing Myanmar. And the fact that they are willing to risk themselves by going out to sea and using human traffickers to escape Myanmar is something that demonstrates their desperation. And whether it's Bangladesh or any of the other countries in that region, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, who also refused them asylum, they are basically violating their responsibilities under the...
All right, so let me just go to Shafiur Rahman. We do apologize for that. Shafiur Rahman, tell us, at this point in time, we'd gotten cut off with you as well. What are your thoughts about these Rohingya at sea? How will this situation be dealt with? Because they're still at sea, some boats at least. And of course, we're not talking about the Myanmar government yet and how they've not been essentially dealing with the situation. They seem to be not even in the picture at this point.
The Myanmar government have not taken any responsibility for what is happening in this situation at all. They would, of course, disown the Rohingya point blank. But my concern is for countries who could do something here. What's required here is, safe disembarkation for these people. And of course, go ahead, screen them. It's necessary. But to leave people adrift on boats, people who are starving, people who have nowhere to go, actually risks another health issue. Because if you don't have managed disembarkation, if your disembarkation is, you don't know where it's going to be, then these people could potentially create a risk. So if you want to do the right thing, if you want to do the sensible thing, you would have managed disembarkation to help these people and to screen them and to look after them. That's what you need to do.
But then, Shafiur Rahman, the argument, Bangladeshi side at least, is that they're hosting so many Rohingya already, right, in Cox's Bazar. I'm just honing in on Bangladesh because that's the country that we're talking about today. And of course, I agree with you that all the countries in the region have a responsibility in this regard. But for countries that are already hosting Rohingya, is it, do you think, unfair of us to expect that they should open their borders even more because, they're dealing with several other issues at the same time?
Well, put it this way. I mean, Bangladesh is able to rescue these people, is able to safely disembark them, is able to screen them like they've done with the Rohingya who disembarked last week. So really, it's up to them to make sure that they do this, because the alternatives are really unconscionable. The alternatives could backfire on the region. Now, Bangladesh was part of this Bali process discussions only 2 months ago. Only 2 months ago, all of these countries that we're talking about, Thailand, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc., all of them were at a meeting in Sri Lanka. And they were talking about the preparedness of these irregular maritime movements. And at that meeting, they stressed the importance of non-refoulement, and they stressed the importance of dealing with irregular movements of refugees and safely dealing with that. All that's gone up the spout. All that's not happening. Suddenly, the pretext of COVID is being used and is being, that's, oh, we need to protect our borders, or we need to protect our people, and so on. The best way to protect your own people is to safely disembark the Rohingya, give them food, screen them, and really address the larger issue of how do you stop genocide in Myanmar, and how do you stop people trying to escape Myanmar.
All right, back with us, Fareed. What are your thoughts about, again, as I'd put to Shafiur Rahman, the fact that, a country like Bangladesh is already dealing with quite a few Rohingya refugees, especially those, of course, in Cox's Bazar. Is it fair for us to then expect Bangladesh to open its borders to even more Rohingya, especially, again, in the context of COVID-19?
Well, the numbers of Rohingya coming in now who are fleeing are a small trickle compared to what it was 2 years ago. So adding a few hundred people into the refugee population right now that's already in Bangladesh is not going to be a huge added burden. In addition, they have responsibilities under the Refugee Convention to not just Bangladesh, but the other countries where these refugees have tried to escape to. The other thing is you've got them on these rickety boats out in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, and people are dying. They're starving to death because they can't land anywhere. And, I mean, we're supposed to show our humanity to the suffering and the persecuted, and there's no one who has suffered more or been persecuted more than the Rohingya.
And do you think that at this point, Fareed, that there has been enough pressure put on the Myanmar government, on Aung San Suu Kyi, for example, to, again, reform their policies towards the Rohingya? Because that's obviously the root cause of all of this, and that needs to be dealt with.
Actually, no, I don't believe there has been enough pressure put on them. The nations, the ASEAN nations in the region continue to do trade. Singapore continues to be a major banking center for senior officials of the government and the military. Japan is investing in Myanmar. This is not the actions of nations that want to make Myanmar do the right thing and address the issue of the persecution of the Rohingya, and to put pressure on them to stop their genocidal policies. There needs to be added pressure put on these nations in the Southeast Asian region, in the Indian Ocean Basin, who continue to do trade with Myanmar, to basically pressure that government to do the right thing. We've got Myanmar currently at the ICJ, and certainly that's put some pressure on the government. But the only thing it seems that a lot of governments understand in situations like this is economics and trade and money, and I think that lever has to be used in order to make them do the right thing.
All right, so Shafiur Rahman, let's talk for a moment about, I'm going to go back to, again, Bangladesh and even Malaysia, really. These are countries which, as I said earlier as well, are dealing with their own respective issues, especially now at this COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that all of the above have received enough support from the international community as well, right? Because that's something that had been an issue not too long ago, where Bangladesh has said, we desperately need more help from the international community to be able to host all of these Rohingya refugees. And, with all the criticism going towards the Bangladeshi government and, that island that they had chosen to host the Rohingya refugees, etc., they still need support because Bangladesh is very much a developing country. Has the world also at large acted enough?
We can attempt an answer at that by looking at the repatriation attempts that Bangladesh has tried. These have failed, and the reason that they've failed is that no humanitarian agency or rights group judge conditions in Rakhine State to be safe. And the people themselves, the Rohingya themselves, were never going to go back to Rakhine State, given their repeated forced repatriations and repeated episodes of catastrophic violence. Now, so really, the international community has to address what is going on in Myanmar, has to address the ongoing genocide in Myanmar. That is the source of all these refugees. And that's what needs to be addressed. And of course, it hasn't happened. There's not been sufficient pressure applied on Myanmar at all. Things are, of course, ramping up now. There are various international mechanisms on the go, the ICC, the ICJ, and also a lawsuit in Argentina. But it isn't sufficient. What you need are international bodies and countries to make sure that Myanmar plays ball and make sure that there are consequences if they don't, including sanctions.
Fred, let's talk for a moment about that sort of international support, right, being given to these refugees and asylum seekers. At this point in time, within this COVID-19 context, I mean, any refugee, and we can talk even in more general terms, even around the world, in places like Greece or otherwise, are probably not getting the international support that they respectively need as well. And I imagine every country is sort of thinking at this point, why should we do more for refugees versus just concentrating on our own citizens and keeping them safe and healthy? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to ignore the refugee crisis, whether it's dealing with the Rohingya or refugees anywhere else in the world, is to basically set up the building blocks for long-term problems in the various regions of the world where refugees are concentrated. In the case of the Rohingya, you have a nation, Bangladesh, which is not economically strong, and it is hosting the largest refugee camp in the world right now. And they're doing it, obviously, with aid from the United Nations and international partners and countries. Canada committed $300 million over 3 years to the refugee situation in Bangladesh, and other nations have committed hundreds of millions of dollars as well. So there is that aspect of it, but the thing is that unless there's more pressure brought to bear by other countries, particularly countries that stand up for human rights, Canada included, unless that pressure is brought to bear on Myanmar, then there is just going to be a repetition of the sorts of long-term refugee problems that we've seen in other parts of the world over the last 20, 30, 40 years. The only way that the problem is going to be addressed is to get, as was being said, to get at the root problem, which is the genocidal policy of the Myanmar government. Both the civilian leaders and the military leaders have to be brought to justice, and there has to be economic pressure put on Myanmar, including, I would say, sanctions, so that they can feel some pain and feel the pressure to do the right thing.
All right, Shafiur, Rahman, a final word before I let you both go. What do you think the coming days hold for these Rohingya at this time? Do you think one of the above countries will do the right thing? And then, again, this is not a solution, right, to this issue. We can't just have waves and waves of Rohingya, even within this situation with coronavirus spreading around the world, leaving their country to seek safety and security. This needs to be resolved at some level, but it's off the radar. So do you think this is only going to get worse?
We must remember what happened in 2015. At that time, Thailand and Malaysia took a very, very hardline approach. They reinforced their borders. They refused to allow any disembarkation. And thousands of Rohingya were basically towed out by the authorities out of their territorial waters, and they were set adrift. So we don't want a repetition of that. We want safe disembarkation, and we want to help these people, and we need these people to be treated with dignity. In terms of crisis management, look, this is a war, and it's physiological that people will leave in a place which is a battlefield, and this is what you expect. So regionally, they've got to come to an agreement about how to manage this whole situation. And that really involves pressuring Myanmar. There's no other way but the solution rests with Myanmar, and they have to be made to see that.
Very well. We'll leave it there, but we, of course, appreciate both of our guests for highlighting this very important issue, again, which is not being spoken about enough around the world. That was Shafiur Rahman speaking to us here from Cambridge, and Farid Khan was speaking to us from Ottawa in Canada quite early in the morning at his end. We appreciate, of course, his time and insight. As I said, viewers, not enough people are speaking about this issue, but nevertheless, it is a crisis just waiting to happen, to have people out at sea seeking safety and security from persecution and not being allowed to dock, not being allowed by countries to enter into their territory out of fear, possibly legitimate fear of COVID-19 and the spread of that within their borders. Nevertheless, as both of our guests have said, there are mechanisms to ensure that testing happens the moment these people reach those shores, but they can't just be left out there to die, literally, as they have just in the past week or so. These are human beings again, just as human beings are stuck in refugee camps in Greece and other places around the world. These are also human beings currently out at sea. And that situation needs to be dealt with, as well as, of course, the root cause, which is the situation in Myanmar, in Rakhine State. Aung San Suu Kyi and that entire government cannot be let off go scot-free. We'll have to, of course, see how the ICJ case also works out at this time. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss COVID-19. Again, about the U.S., and this time we're going to talk about hate crimes there. The FBI has spoken about the growing potential for hate crimes against minorities in the wake of the pandemic in that country. According to the head of the FBI, in a letter that he sent on Monday to law enforcement officials, around the country, he wrote that his agency remains, and I'm going to quote him now, concerned about potential for hate crimes by individuals and groups targeting minority populations in the U.S. who they believe are responsible for the spread of coronavirus, end quote. Now, of course, if we're completely honest, those in the firing line at this point in time, those who are being targeted are largely Asian Americans or those who look Asian within the country. And that, of course, is very troubling on many levels, because when we talk about racism, sometimes we only talk about certain groups, but it seems that racism really does cross many boundaries, and racism against one can easily be translated into racism towards others, as the same with hate crime and hate speech, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Darrin, who is a criminal justice expert and television commentator. He's joining us this morning from New York. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Joseph Williams, who is senior news editor at U.S. News and World Report. He covers social determinants of race and national trends. And joining us from D.C. as well is Shahed Amanullah, who is a former senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State. Shahed, Joseph, and Darrin, a good morning to all three of you, and thank you for your time this morning. Shahed, let me start with you. What do you make of this warning by the head of the FBI? Again, it's not new. There has been a concern about hate crimes growing in the U.S. anyhow, but this time against Asian Americans. I mean, it seems that it's crossing boundaries from different groups.
Well, if you talk to law enforcement officials, going back a decade or more, you've had the raw materials for this always in place in this country. It's just that what's happening right now is we kind of have this perfect storm. We have this incredible fear of this pandemic. People actually feel like their lives are at stake, but they also want to lash out. And these groups and these people who are lashing out right now at Asian Americans have always had this sentiment, deeply held. They were just waiting for kind of their moment. And this is their moment, especially when you have people who are kind of idled, who have been maybe laid off, et cetera. They've got plenty of time on their hands. They want to go online and cause mischief. And one of the ways they think they can kind of dent their universe is by reintroducing these kinds of racist themes into the public discourse as a way of kind of lashing out because of this. And the FBI and other institutions have been aware of kind of these things for a very long time. I know even 10 years ago, I was getting some of this online hate from these folks when I was at the State Department, and talking to law enforcement officials at that time, they felt that this was kind of like this large undercurrent that was kind of being ignored by a lot of people. But now we can't ignore it anymore.
Yeah. Joseph, obviously this has to do with the politics of all of this, right? So when Donald Trump calls this the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, and that's of course been condemned across the board by many within the U.S., but nevertheless, I imagine that's stuck with some people. Do you think that has a huge role to play within this sort of racism we're seeing now against Asian Americans?
I think that Yes, absolutely it does. Is the short answer. The longer answer is that this has been baked into the United States for quite some time. The problem here is that the country has been founded by people who, while touting the ideals of equality, didn't always practice it. I mean, what comes to mind early on is Jim Crow laws after slavery was ended, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the various levels of hate crimes against Muslims and South Asian Americans after 9/11. So always in times of fear and anxiety, this is absolutely what our country defaults to. The problem that we have here is that it's coming from the top, and it's not just coming from Donald Trump. As you'll recall, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the G20 Accords fought, not just recommended, but fought to include description of this pandemic as the Wuhan virus, just to get the administration a little bit less heat for a flat-footed response. Yeah. So sadly, it's been a part of the United States for quite some time. You know, another element of hate against South Asians and Asians in general was during World War II, and we had internment camps. Yeah. The problem also is compounded by the fact that we have a situation of a lot of high anxiety and a leadership vacuum at the top. We don't have a George W. Bush going to a mosque. We don't have President Trump denouncing, or President Obama, denouncing hate crimes. We have a president that's actively, in some ways, encouraging this, particularly when white nationalists start gathering in defiance of a nationwide lockdown. So it's going to be very difficult for the FBI to tamp this down when you have so many elements of executive department leadership thinking that this is just fine.
Yeah. All right, but Darrin, you know, the laws are in place, aren't there, in the U.S. to deal with any hate crimes? And we had that attack on that woman in New York, again, probably just because she did look Asian or was of East Asian descent, from what I've understood, and that's what essentially was the reason why she was targeted. But I mean, of course, there are, I'm sure, many other cases that we can probably cite within the U.S. Do you think the law will do the right thing in this case, and that these people will be made an example of, so that others know not to do this?
It's difficult at this point in time to determine if a law, in fact, would be something that would be prudent in preventing these types of heinous attacks. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been quantitatively tracking hate crimes in the United States for years on end. And when we look at the evolution, or I should say the erection of the United States, hate crimes have been a part of this culture. And it's really interesting because when we look at the dynamic component of the United States, this is something that's built on immigration. And when we look at, as one of my prior colleagues mentioned, when we look at what happened during the 9/11 attacks, we saw an uptick in violence against people of Middle Eastern descent going back to 2001. Yeah. One of the things that we do have to take in consideration is this. This is something that not just, I mean, I understand laws are great, but this is something that the population needs to band together and take a stand against xenophobia. Because if this continues to manifest, ultimately what it does is it denigrates our society. So I don't think that the political leaders nor lawmakers would be the answer. I think this is something that should happen on the granular level, the grassroots of people that are in this society. So moving forward, this is more of a global issue. It's not just a U.S. issue.
Indeed. So, Shahed, let's talk for a moment about how the media has also been acting through this. Do you think that media, be it in the U.S. or mainstream, really around the world, because this sort of racism against Asian Americans is not limited just to U.S. I mean, this has happened in Europe as well. I believe in France too. There were a couple of Twitter, hashtags trending about how Asian Americans are not carriers just automatically by default of coronavirus, et cetera, or are not dirty. I mean, as in their restaurants are not necessarily automatically by default dirty just because that's the perception now. Do you think that this is something that media has been responsible for, or do you think that there is, somebody out there who's actually calling this out?
Well, look, we have multiple kinds of media, right? We have the mainstream media, and we've got social media, and we have fringe media. And some media outlets are actually doing a good job. You see lots of messaging out there about how we all have to band together. But we also have these fringe media outlets that are putting out racist memes, racist speculations about not just how the disease spread, but how the disease can be cured and who's affected by it. You're seeing now racist memes being put out that claim that certain races are more susceptible than others and that it was designed to hit certain races. So all these things to kind of stir up hatred. Now, if we look at kind of the response from a healthcare perspective, we've come to understand that if we all act together, we can fight this. But that also spills over to the social realm. If we all band together as one group of people, we can fight this. The minute we start separating by these lines, where some people are citizens and other people are conditional citizens, then we're going to interrupt not just the social fabric, but our ability to fight this virus, where we're called upon to act together. And if even a few people step outside, we jeopardize everybody.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Joseph, because, as much as one would understand that at this point of high stress, where there would naturally, it would be expected for some people to lash out in a racist fashion, unfortunately, but that's just the reality of the world. But do you think that also many people, i.e. those immigrants, be they first generation, second generation, or third generation, do you think a lot of them are sort of reevaluating their place within American society if it's that easy to turn against them now?
I think it's inevitable. And the tragic part of this is that immigration is, as racism has been built into the United States, so has immigration. And immigration has been one of the things that has created such wealth and such dynamism in the United States. So having people question whether or not they're actually American because someone decided to point the finger at them for a virus that nature created and that has been spread by human behavior, it's just really tragic in my view. It's very difficult to have people question whether or not they are part of the American experiment. But I think that your earlier guest was correct, that this is a pandemic in and of itself, and the way to fight it is by unifying and by creating a message that this is wrong and this will not be tolerated. A lot of times, and the message that sort of a message will come most effectively from the top. Again, we have a vacuum of leadership here in this particular realm, so it's up to the grassroots to try to get this done. Whether or not it will happen in an era where everyone is afraid, everyone is anxious, that remains to be seen. But those of us who know the best of humanity and know the best of this country, we still have to remain hopeful because really there's no other option.
Darrin, as my introduction, it's fascinating to see how racism can, again, cross boundaries, right, and very quickly. So where you would have, where we would talk about a lot of racism and, of course, police brutality towards African Americans, now we have the same sort of thing, not at that level, of course, but towards Asian Americans as well. And then, we've spoken about, of course, post 9/11 towards Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and even South Asian Americans at that time. Do you think that there is within all of these different groups some sort of unity, or that there needs to be further unity in fighting this sort of racism? Because I would imagine that also there needs to be unity within all of these groups that are facing this racism as well.
Well, when I think to racism, I look to that as self-hatred of self. When I say self-hatred of self, oftentimes what's burning inside of someone based on their inability to execute on what they would like to, is something that now proliferates to other individuals. And that's why I see racism that's where I see at the basis of racism. Do people need to band together? Sure, but you have it on both sides. You have ultimately people that are the victims of racism based on practices in a professional setting and a social setting that oftentimes suppress another group. And you have these individuals that are the people that perpetuate the racism that tend to band together with other individuals. I want to say people that pile on, so to speak. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We need to have a grassroots movement of citizens that are diametrically opposed to the practice of racism, because racism is something that's been here for years on end. When we look to the practice of slavery, et cetera, and we can speak to this at the dinner table and have these tabletop exercises, but that really doesn't go into a full-blown execution. It needs to be something that people, the citizenry, needs to come together and take a stand against. I mean, I'm all for protesting and things to that effect, but the action plan is something that I've seen for many years on end has not been consistent. And when we look at how to band together that plan of action in preventing it and getting beyond it, it's something that seems to be lost.
Shahed is also, let's not forget, an election year, right? And it seems, according to many, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, that Donald Trump may very well be seeking to distract and or deflect attention away from blame on himself and his administration and try to find scapegoats. And possibly that's where he's possibly getting this term Chinese virus / Wuhan virus from. What are your thoughts on that? Because this will continue, right? I mean, all experts are saying that we will see a second wave in fall / winter. So it's not like we're seeing the end of this. This will continue. Will this sort of racism get worse?
Well, there are many ways to win an election, and the worst possible way to do it is by doing it on the backs of other people. And you're right. I think that this is driven primarily by the need to kind of protect this person's political legacy and get them into a second term. But as my colleagues have mentioned, in the vacuum of leadership from the top, we need to respond with reaching out to our neighbors. We need to show people that we're all in this together. We have to show people that there are people of color and immigrants who are bringing them their food, who are healing them in the hospitals. That we don't deserve the status of earned citizenship. We are citizens equal to everybody else. And that kind of message, I think, will play into the election. I think by the time we get to the election, we'll have this very stark choice. We have a group of Americans that banded together as one to do the right thing to save each other. And we have another group of Americans that pulled themselves out of the mainstream and pointed fingers and demonized. And that, unfortunately, includes the president.
Yeah, as Darrin had pointed earlier, sure, there may be blame on different governments around the world for how coronavirus played out and how the pandemic played out, but that shouldn't reflect onto all Asian Americans or even all Chinese Americans, right? I mean, or even just Chinese, period, regardless of what one's opinions on that may be. But what do you think is the role then of online misinformation in that very regard? Because that's also an important aspect of all this, right? A lot of this sort of hate festers online through fake news.
It does. And the problem there is that we don't have an effective method for tamping that down. I mean, it's difficult to organize a protest online, and a lot of these hate groups and fear-mongering web pages are virtually underground and very hard to detect unless you're in the know. But I'd like to go address a further point is that we talked, the four of us, about anxiety related to the virus. I think it can be extended a bit further and talk about economic and inequity in our society that we're trying to overcome. I mean, people tend to demonize when things are bad. When things are good, you get along with your neighbor. You really don't have much to fear. But we've got a lot of division in politics. We also have a lot of division economically. And when economic anxiety couples with political and social anxiety, you have a mix that's very, very difficult to counteract, because people are afraid that they have and that they're not going to have anymore, and that the people that the government is trying to help are going to take resources away from them. So it all factors into this really nasty mix. And so I would suggest, in order to fight this, not only do we have to have a social movement, we have to have a political and economic movement to make sure that people aren't left behind, and to make sure that people who are under-resourced are helped along, and that people are informed that this is for the greater good, that helping your neighbor and helping those who have less doesn't mean that those.
And that's a very good point, Joseph. I apologize for cutting just because we're running out of time, so I wanted to give the final word to Darrin. Darrin, in just under a minute, if you can, how important is the economic aspect that Joseph there just mentioned? It makes sense there, right, that a lot of people probably are really worried, of course, especially those who have been laid off or fired, about how they're going to bring their next meal onto the table.
Absolutely. Socioeconomic empowerment is at the apex of this. And oftentimes, I think this is in many ways is more profound than the racial separation. It's the people that fall within a certain socioeconomic class that are the driving force or the mechanism that can implement change. And unfortunately, the African American, or I should say the minority population, hasn't been at the apex of this structure. So moving forward, as we get through this, we need a greater dissemination of wealth within that minority population that can put us in a better place moving forward in terms of something like this happening in the future, because we clearly see the results of this when we didn't have the socioeconomic empowerment.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. First, we appreciate all three of our guests for their time this morning. That was Darrin speaking to us from New York, and Joseph and Shahed, who were both speaking to us from Washington, D.C., respectively. Viewers, of course, we appreciate you joining us as well for this specific segment because, again, when we're talking about hate crimes in the U.S., I've always, in my introduction, as I said today, we've always spoken about certain specific groups, right? And it seems, and it's interesting also to observe how this sort of racism can very easily translate from one group onto another. And so if you don't deal with one form of racism, it seems that then it gives that sort of power and almost approval to racists to then move on to other groups if it's not dealt with and nipped in the bud. So it seems at this point in time that, as all of our guests agreed upon, sure, there needs to be a lot of unity at this time, but we also need leadership within the U.S. to, at least at this point in time, speak out against this and not to refer to the coronavirus as the Chinese virus, as the Wuhan virus, which all experts around the world agree are not the correct terms to be using. Now, nevertheless, there are sure disagreements around the world about the roots of this and all of the above. I mean, the political debates will continue behind the scenes, but nevertheless, it's not people, it's not citizens of any or either country who should be held accountable if it's the governments who are quibbling over who already started all of this. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.